We have on our panel Zemedeneh, who I think most of you will recognize as a managing partner of Ernst & Young, who has done quite a bit of work in Ethiopia, including with Ethiopian Airlines, who has now become the largest in Africa. So Zemedeneh, you've worked across Africa, you've worked across the globe in Latin America and across the continent. My question to you is, why are we getting this investment into Ethiopia? What is the comparative and competitive advantages? And to make it in plain language, why does it make sense for business people, such as the ones we have here in the audience, to invest in Ethiopia? What is the key features that make it, profitable? So that's my question to you. If you could divide it up even, addressing foreign investors and local investors, since we have a mix, that would be wonderful.
It's always great to be up here. I'm particularly happy here because I just came from an amazing event this morning. I was telling Henok, I think Mr. Fitzum also mentioned it, but I think I'm the only one who has the bragging right, because I think I'm the only one who was at the ceremony this morning. I came from the inauguration of the Ethiopia-Djibouti Railway this morning, so we need to give Ethiopia a round of applause. So I'm going to sort of use that as my entry to the question that Henok asked me. Why would you want to invest in Ethiopia, right? I mean, this is a good question. We're all business people. In addition to what I do with my consulting side, like everybody else, I see the opportunities and I put what little money I have in this country, right? So that means I have to believe in what is going on here. So there are a number of things. I think my good friend, the CEO, I call him the CEO of the Ethiopian Investment Commission, Mr. Fitzum, has covered all the bases. So I'm not going to repeat what he said, but I want to build up on that in the next couple minutes. So when you look at a country, any country, and I've done business around the world, there are some basic characteristics that you look for before you put money, right? Whether it's the sector that we're talking about here or whatever. So in the case of Ethiopia, I mean, the macro view will be, it's an economy driven by fundamentals. What does that mean? I'm sure there are some people here from very rich oil-producing countries in Africa, natural resource-driven countries in Africa. Unfortunately, for the last couple of years, and with some forecasts showing for the next 2-3 years, they'll be struggling because commodity prices have collapsed. Now, I don't want to say we've been sitting on our sofas and applauding the collapse of commodity prices in Ethiopia, but we are one of the beneficiaries of the downside of oil at $45 a barrel. We and our good friends, the Kenyans, of the larger economies in Africa. So when I talk about growth driven by fundamentals, it means that the underbelly, the infrastructure, all the other elements that have to be there for economic transformation are either there or it's a work in progress. So the railway I started out with because not only is coincidental that I was there a couple of hours ago, but it's also a very powerful illustration of what it means to have an economy driven by fundamentals. So if I'm a manufacturer, and I think this topic of what we're talking about here today is really, if I were to summarize Ethiopia's economic future over the next 10 years, it's what I call export or die, manufacture or die. I know it sounds a bit dramatic, but the fact of the matter is Ethiopia is trying to become South Korea, Ethiopia is trying to become China, and what drove those countries to prosperity is manufacturing. And I think the presentation that you saw from Mr. Fitzum demonstrates that. The big investments in the industrial parks. I was at the opening of the Awasa Industrial Park a couple months ago. Very impressive. The largest in Africa for that particular sector, 1.3 million square meters. As he's indicated, that place is already completely full. That's what I call growth driven by fundamentals. For us as Africans, for us as Ethiopians to be transformed, it has to be in the back of value-added manufacturing, which includes the sector we're gathered here for, which is agriculture. Garments, textiles, leather, whatever. I mean, those are the types of things that is going to transform this country, and that is what is attracting investors. So Henok asked me, what are some of the competitive and comparative advantages that Ethiopia has that will attract, by the way, including the Ethiopian domestic private sector, which quite a lot of you are here in this room. So last week, just as I like examples, I like illustrations of substance to talk about stories of successes. So last week, we had the quality leather shoe industry gathering organized by the Americans. And the people in that room represented 80% of the American leather shoe market, 80%. Last week, right here in this room, in this conference center. And one of the arguments that they were making was, today 70% of the leather shoes in the United States, where I live part of the time, is imported from China, 70%. And they're saying that by 2020, it'll be down to 55%. When we're talking about billions of dollars worth of shoes, that 15% reduction has to go somewhere. And that's the reason they were here. Why? Again, I go back to my main theme of argument, which is fundamentals. So if you are the largest owner of hides and skins in Africa, which is Ethiopia, would it not make sense to produce that product right here? That's what the Americans have concluded. Why buy the leather here, ship it to China for processing, for export to the United States? That's the kind of fundamentals we're talking about. So that's the comparative and competitive advantage that Ethiopia has. The same thing in leather, the same thing in textiles and garments and things like that. I always use the example of a country that I used to work in, I used to live in, which is Saudi Arabia. Many years ago, the Saudis decided that they want to be the leaders in the petrochemical industry, because the raw material for petrochemical is what? The stuff that comes in abundance from the ground in Saudi Arabia. The same logic applies to Ethiopia. The hides and skin we have in abundance. As Mr. Fisum said, we haven't really done a whole lot of it with it yet, but if you're an investor, that's the kind of opportunity. That's the competitive and the comparative advantages that we're seeing. Okay? So specifically for this industry, that's the kind of example. But at the macro level, again, not to belabor the point that was already addressed, 4 key points: investments in infrastructure, as was stated earlier, the enormous amount of power that is needed to run industries in Africa. I mean, the Achilles heel for Africa for industrialization is the lack of power. I mean, go to any city in Africa, any country in Africa, with a few exceptions, power goes out every 5 minutes. You can't run factories like that. What is not available, or if it's available, it's damn expensive. So when we talk about Ethiopia, again, from a competitive advantage, whether it's leather, garments, textiles, car manufacturing, I don't know how many of you have noticed that 4 of the largest Chinese car manufacturers build cars in Ethiopia. The French car manufacturer Peugeot just started manufacturing cars in Ethiopia. And the German car maker Volkswagen, its truck division, already makes trucks in Ethiopia. So when we talk about actually the industrialization of this country is competitive and comparative advantages, it's actually broader than the industry that we gather here to talk about. But it's important to put that in perspective. So again, going back to try to summarize what I said, if the infrastructure is there, especially power, if the transport and logistics is there, as was said earlier, with not only the railways, the air transport, and for those of you who are not aware of the fact that the largest merchant fleet in Africa, owned by an African, is right here in Ethiopia. Ethiopia owns the largest merchant fleet, despite the fact it's a landlocked country. So you got to look at it from an integrated perspective. And of course, my favorite part of the competitive advantage, which is the labor force. As was said earlier, very young, very dynamic. There are very few people with gray hair like me in this country. All of them are very young. 70% of them very young. Deployable workforce at affordable wages. As I think is mentioned earlier, but it helps to repeat, it costs anywhere between $450 to $600 on average in manufacturing in China. Ethiopian wages today are a fraction. Yes, they will go up eventually, but they're still a fraction. On top of that, add productivity. Productivity is key. I mean, if you look at the World Economic Forum's annual competitiveness index, most of African countries are at the bottom. They're starting to improve, but competitively. So we've done a very quick study, and I'll wrap this up. We saw on some of the factories that have transplanted from China, without mentioning some of the companies because of confidential reasons. There's a company that we're aware of that came here 4 years ago, started producing in Ethiopia. It's been producing in China for 30 years. In 4 years, productivity at their factories in Ethiopia are almost equal to the Chinese factories. It's a fact. So we can share with you offline who this company is. So when you summarize all this, Henok, to answer your question in a long-winded way, I think the competitive advantages are here. And I think ultimately many of the other elements that will make Ethiopia a competitor in the global scheme with 100 million people, adding 2 million to the population every single year, that is a workforce that could transform Ethiopia into the manufacturing hub that China was, which is trying to offload to countries like Ethiopia, and hopefully Ethiopia will be competitive. Thank you very much.